I accidentally discovered my deceased husband's offshore investment portfolio. There was $47 million sitting there. He always insisted we were broke, and his income was barely $600 a week. I phoned the brokerage. The agent paused and whispered 3 words. He left instructions. My chest tightened so hard I had to grip the kitchen island just to stay upright. I placed the phone onto the granite countertop deliberately, as if moving too fast might shatter the reality of what I was hearing. Richard passed away 11 months ago. It was a massive stroke right after dinner. He had just set his fork down on the plate, looked out the kitchen window at the fading evening light, and collapsed. It was devastating and absolute. We were married for 26 years. If you had asked me the morning of his funeral, I would have sworn under oath that I knew every mundane, tedious detail of that man's existence. I would have told you he took his coffee black, hated the smell of lavender, and worried endlessly about our crumbling finances. I would have been completely oblivious. I found the drive on a humid Thursday afternoon. I was finally clearing out his detached garage, suffocating in the smell of old motor oil and damp cardboard. I bumped his old workbench and knocked over a heavy, broken ham radio he used to tinker with on weekends. The casing cracked open when it hit the concrete floor. Tucked inside the battery compartment, wrapped meticulously in black electrical tape, was a small titanium USB drive. I took it inside and plugged it into my laptop at exactly 3:15 p.m. There were no folders, no personal files, just a single encrypted shortcut to a private wealth management portal based in Geneva. The browser opened, a biometric prompt flashed, bypassed by a digital key stored on the drive itself, and then the dashboard loaded. The total assets line glowed on my screen in a sterile, minimalist font. $47,512,900. I stared at the glowing pixels for almost an hour. My vision blurred, but the numbers didn't change. Richard was a high school geography teacher. Even at the peak of his career, he never cleared more than $3,400 a month after taxes. We drove a rattling 2004 Honda Civic until the transmission literally fell out in stop-and-go traffic on the interstate. In 2021, we engaged in a brutal, screaming, shouting match about fixing our leaking roof, ultimately choosing to place plastic buckets in the hallway for an entire winter because the $4,200 repair estimate was completely out of our reach. I used to wake up at 3 in the morning to the sound of freezing rain dripping into plastic buckets, while my husband slept soundly next to me. But the memory that made me physically sick, sitting there in the glow of the laptop, happened in 2018. Our teenage daughter, Lily, developed a severe jaw infection that required complex oral surgery. Our cut-rate insurance refused to cover it, leaving a $14,000 gap we simply didn't possess. I watched my daughter cry from the pain for 9 grueling months. Her face was swollen. She couldn't chew solid food. We desperately sold off furniture, including my grandmother's antique dining set, just to afford the initial deposits for the procedure. I remember breaking down in the dental clinic parking lot the day of her surgery. I was sobbing over the steering wheel, utterly humiliated by our poverty, while Richard stroked my hair and promised we would survive this. We survived it, sure. Meanwhile, he had $47 million sitting in a Swiss vault. I picked up the phone from the granite countertop and picked up the call again. I dialed the international number on the portal. A woman answered with sterile, high-end corporate discretion. I provided my name and Richard's social security number. I explained about the USB drive. I demanded answers. Silence stretched across the line. Then, she whispered those 3 words. He left instructions. She recovered her professional tone immediately, coldly stating that to proceed, I had to present myself physically at their European headquarters with notarized death certificates and proof of identity. No proxies, no exceptions. That night, the grief I had been drowning in for 11 months simply evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. My mind drifted to Richard's former college roommate, Gerald. Gerald had slapped me with a frivolous civil lawsuit 2 months ago. He claimed Richard owed him our house based on an alleged verbal contract from a failed .com startup they tried to launch back in 1999. My lawyer, Alec Mercer, told me not to worry about it, calling it a baseless intimidation tactic. But Gerald had been relentlessly harassing Alec's office, desperate to force a quick settlement that involved taking immediate possession of the property. I always found it bizarre how aggressive he was being over a modest, aging 3-bedroom home in a mediocre school district. He didn't want to pay out. He wanted the keys. By sunrise, I booked a direct flight to Switzerland. The Geneva brokerage was located on the top floor of a pristine steel high-rise that overlooked the lake. The air inside smelled like polished leather and expensive quiet. An impeccably dressed executive named Nathaniel entered a boardroom carrying a locked portfolio. He verified my passport, the notarized death certificate, and the USB drive in total silence. Then, he slid a sleek bezel-less tablet across the mahogany table. There was no letter. It was a pre-recorded video. I tapped the screen. Richard's face appeared. He looked tired. It was recorded in his detached garage, the walls familiar behind him. Eleanor, if you are watching this, it means Gerald finally made his move, Richard's digital ghost said, his voice flat. I am so incredibly sorry. The money is from a proprietary algorithm Gerald and I built decades ago. Gerald wanted to sell it to a private defense contractor. I knew what they were going to use it for. I couldn't let that happen. So I stole the source code, sold it privately to a European telecom giant through blind proxies, and hid the wealth. I couldn't touch a single dime, Eleanor. If our lifestyle changed even a fraction, Gerald would know I was the one who betrayed him. He would have killed me. He doesn't want the house, Eleanor. He wants the physical master server hard drives I buried inside the basement walls. The video cut to black. I sat frozen. My husband hadn't just been cheap. He had sacrificed our comfort, my peace of mind, and our daughter's health to maintain a decades-long cover story. Nathaniel cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence in the boardroom. Madam, we were notified yesterday that an individual matching Gerald's description attempted to use counterfeit documents to liquidate this portfolio. He is becoming desperate. I turned off the tablet, the sickening puzzle finally complete. I looked out at the sprawling Swiss skyline, the weight of 26 years of lies finally settling into my bones. Nathaniel, I said, my voice shockingly steady as I stood up. I need you to freeze everything immediately. Then, I want you to hire the most ruthless private security firm in Europe and send them to my home address. We are going to let Gerald break in one last time. I flew back to the States the next morning. I didn't sleep on the plane. I just stared at the seatback screen, watching the little digital plane slowly crawl across the Atlantic, running the math of my marriage over and over in my head. $14,000 for Lily's jaw. $47 million in Geneva. The numbers refused to reconcile. Duncan Strand was waiting in my driveway when my taxi pulled up. He was the contact Nathaniel had arranged, a former corporate fraud investigator who specialized in high-liability asset protection. He didn't look like a mercenary. He wore a muted gray suit, carried a scuffed leather briefcase, and spoke with the quiet, methodical cadence of an insurance adjuster. Mrs. Harlow, Duncan said, extending a hand. The house is secure. We haven't touched the drywall in the basement. We've installed micro cameras in the ventilation grates and motion sensors along the perimeter. If he enters the property, we will know before he reaches the basement door. And then what? I asked, unlocking the front door and letting him into the foyer. Then we wait for him to expose the server racks. Once he has the hardware in his hands, he's committed felony burglary and corporate espionage. My team secures him. We hand him over to the local authorities with a neatly bowed evidence package. And your husband's offshore assets remain securely yours. It sounded so simple. Clinical. I left Duncan in the kitchen reviewing the camera feeds on his laptop and walked toward the basement door. I needed to see it. The basement smelled like damp earth and mildew. I walked past the plastic storage bins filled with Christmas ornaments and Lily's old elementary school art projects. I stopped in front of the far wall right behind the rusted utility sink. It was the only section of drywall that had been replaced in the last 10 years. Richard told me a pipe had burst back in 2015. I picked up a claw hammer from the tool pegboard. I didn't swing hard, just enough to crack the plaster. I peeled away a jagged chunk of drywall. Behind the insulation, sitting perfectly flush against the cinderblock foundation, was a heavy steel casing. I chipped away more drywall until I could see the ventilation fans of the hidden server rack, thickly coated in years of dust, hardwired directly into the house's electrical panel. But it wasn't the blinking green light on the server that caught my attention. It was a cheap, fireproof lockbox resting on top of the metal casing. I pulled it out. The latch wasn't locked. I flipped it open, expecting more thumb drives or legal documents. Instead, I found a thick stack of bank receipts. I pulled them out into the dim light of the basement bulb. They were wire transfer confirmations from our joint checking account, hundreds of them dating back 15 years. $200, $350, $500. They were all routed to a domestic LLC registered in Delaware. I recognized the company name from the lawsuit paperwork Alec Mercer had given me. It was Gerald's holding company. My breath caught in my throat. Richard said in the video he couldn't touch the millions because Gerald would know he betrayed him. But these receipts told a different story. Richard was actively draining his meager teacher's salary, the money we relied on for groceries, for the water bill, for Lily's clothes, to pay Gerald off. It was extortion. Gerald knew Richard had done something, or suspected it, and had been bleeding my husband dry for years. And Richard, terrified of losing his hidden fortune, had simply paid the ransom using the very funds his family needed to survive. He didn't just hide wealth, he actively impoverished us to protect it. My phone buzzed in my back pocket. I jumped, dropping a handful of receipts onto the concrete floor. I pulled it out. It was a text from Lily. Mom, I'm at my apartment near campus. Gerald just showed up. My thumbs shook as I typed back. Are you okay? Do not let him in. 3 dots appeared. Then her response came through. I didn't. I talked to him through the door. Mom, he told me Dad owed him for my jaw surgery. He said Dad borrowed the $14,000 from him and never paid it back, and that's why he's taking our house. What is he talking about? Why didn't you tell me Dad borrowed money for me? I stared at the screen, the basement suddenly feeling entirely devoid of oxygen. Gerald wasn't waiting to break in. He was changing the rules. He was using my daughter's deepest guilt, the cost of her medical care, to force my hand. I hit the call button so hard my thumbnail cracked against the glass screen. It rang once before she picked up. Lily, I said, forcing my voice into a low, steady register I absolutely did not feel. Is he still in the hallway? No, she sniffled, her voice tight and high. He left a minute after I wouldn't open the door. He slid an envelope under the frame. Mom, it's a copy of a promissory note. It has Dad's signature on it. It says $14,000. Dated the exact week of my surgery. What is happening? Did Dad mortgage his life to this guy for my teeth? Listen to me very carefully, I said, staring at the scattered wire transfer receipts on the basement floor. Do not open the door if he comes back. Pack an overnight bag. I am sending a car to pick you up. You are coming home right now, and I will explain everything when you get here. But the note is a fabrication, Lily. Your father lied about a lot of things, but he did not borrow money from Gerald for your surgery. Gerald is trying to manipulate you, so I'll hand over the house. Do you understand? It's a tactic. She was quiet for a long second. Okay, I'll pack. I hung up and knelt on the cold concrete to gather the receipts. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was rage. A hot, vibrating rage that started in my stomach and radiated out to my fingertips. Gerald knew exactly what he was doing. He couldn't legally claim the house without a protracted court battle he'd eventually lose, so he was attacking the weakest point in our defenses, a 19-year-old girl who already felt guilty about her family's financial struggles. I shoved the receipts back into the fireproof box, grabbed it, and marched up the wooden stairs to the kitchen. Duncan was still sitting at the island, watching a grid of black and white camera feeds on his laptop. He looked up as I dropped the heavy metal box onto the granite with a loud crack. Change of plans, I said. Gerald isn't going to break in. He's trying to force me to hand over the deed voluntarily by terrorizing my daughter. I opened the box and slid the stack of bank receipts across the counter. Duncan picked up the top few, his eyes scanning the routing numbers and the Delaware LLC name. His professional, detached demeanor shifted just a fraction. He pulled a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and slipped them on. This is a systematic drain, Duncan murmured, flipping through the dates. Monthly wires. The amounts fluctuate, but they never stop. He was bleeding your husband for over a decade. It's blackmail, I said. Richard told me in the video he couldn't touch the offshore money because Gerald would know. But Gerald obviously already knew something, or suspected enough to extort him on a teacher's salary. Richard paid him out of our checking account. The money we used for groceries. Duncan, he impoverished us to keep Gerald quiet. Duncan pulled up a new tab on his browser and started typing rapidly. Let's see who actually owns this LLC. Delaware is notorious for corporate secrecy, but if Gerald was lazy, there might be a paper trail linking it directly to him. While Duncan worked, I called Alec Mercer. My lawyer answered on the third ring, sounding exhausted. Eleanor, I'm heading into court in 20 minutes. Is this an emergency? Gerald just showed up at Lily's apartment near campus, I said. He slid a fake promissory note under her door, claiming Richard borrowed the surgery money from him. He's using my daughter to bypass you and guilt me into a settlement. Alec cursed softly. That violates the cease and desist I sent his counsel on Tuesday. He's crossing a massive line here. I'll file a restraining order this afternoon. Did Lily keep the note? Yes, but Alec, there's something else. I'm going through Richard's old files. I found wire transfers. Richard was paying Gerald's holding company hundreds of dollars a month for the last 15 years. Silence on the line. Then, Alec's tone shifted from rushed lawyer to dead serious. Eleanor, why would Richard do that? I couldn't tell him about the $47 million. Not on an unsecured line. And not when I was still trying to untangle the legal mess of the stolen source code. If Alec knew the house contained stolen corporate property, as an officer of the court, he might be obligated to report it. I don't know. I lied smoothly. But I think Gerald was extorting him over a past business dispute. And now that Richard is dead, and the payment stopped, Gerald wants the house as compensation. Don't throw anything away. Don't speak to Gerald. If he shows up at the house, call the police immediately. I'll handle the restraining order for Lily. I hung up just as a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway on the security feed. Duncan tapped the screen. That's my associate. Duncan said. He's going to pick up your daughter and bring her straight here. I nodded, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Did you find anything on the LLC? Duncan turned the laptop toward me. I didn't find Gerald. I found someone else. The registered agent for the LLC isn't Gerald. It's a woman named Miriam Voss. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I gripped the edge of the counter. You know her, Duncan observed quietly. She was the principal at Richard's high school. I whispered. She retired about 5 years ago. Miriam Voss, a stern, humorless woman who used to attend our summer barbecues. She was always impeccably dressed, always driving a leased Mercedes she claimed her husband paid for. Richard always seemed so anxious around her, bending over backward to make sure her wine glass was full. I had always assumed he was just sucking up to his boss to secure his tenure. Why would his principal be the registered agent for a company receiving blackmail payments? I asked, a sick feeling returning to my stomach. Duncan tapped a pen against his notepad. Usually, in an extortion ring, you have the muscle and you have the leverage. Gerald was Richard's old roommate. He knew about the stolen algorithm. But Miriam was his boss. She controlled his day-to-day life, his paycheck, his pension. If Gerald didn't live in the state, he needed someone local to keep an eye on Richard, to make sure he wasn't spending money he wasn't supposed to. She was his handler, I realized. The absurdity of the word tasting like ash in my mouth. A high school principal was babysitting my husband for a defense contractor's lackey, and collecting a fee for it. Most likely, Duncan added. He clicked on another link. I just pulled property records for Miriam Voss. She owns a modest townhouse about 20 miles from here, but she also owns 2 rental properties in Sedona and a condo in Aspen, none of which you can afford on a public school administrator's pension. My husband's entire existence had been a carefully constructed prison, and he had dragged me and Lily into the cell with him. Every time he claimed we couldn't afford a vacation, every time he yelled about the grocery bill being $20 over budget, Miriam Voss was cashing a check in Aspen. Okay, I said, my voice hardening. Gerald thinks he has the upper hand because he has the fake promissory note and the lawsuit. He doesn't know we found the server, and he doesn't know we found the receipts. What do you want to do? Duncan asked. I want to pay Miriam Voss a visit before Lily gets home. Duncan closed his laptop. I advise against confronting accomplices without legal counsel present, Mrs. Harlow. I'm not going to confront her. I'm going to return a favor. I picked up the stack of wire transfers and shoved them into my purse. She likes keeping secrets. Let's see how she handles it when someone else holds the leverage. I left Duncan at the house to wait for Lily and took my keys. The drive to Miriam's townhouse took exactly 32 minutes. I didn't listen to the radio. I just gripped the steering wheel, replaying the last 26 years of my life. Every compromised dinner, every skipped dental appointment, every tear Lily shed over her jaw. Miriam lived in a gated community for affluent retirees. I tailgated a delivery van through the security gates and parked across from her unit. It was a pristine brick townhouse with manicured hedges and a sprawling front porch. I walked up the path and rang the bell. A minute later, the door opened. Miriam Voss stood there, wearing a silk blouse and holding a crystal glass of iced tea. She looked older, her hair entirely silver now, but she still had that same rigid, authoritative posture. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me, but she recovered quickly. Eleanor, she said, her voice smooth and practiced. What a surprise. I haven't seen you since Richard's memorial. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I said, stepping forward so she was forced to step back or let me in. She hesitated, then stepped aside. The interior of the townhouse was immaculate. Vaulted ceilings, abstract art, expensive Persian rugs. It smelled like expensive vanilla candles and wealth. Can I get you something to drink? She offered, gesturing toward the kitchen. No, I said, stopping in the middle of her living room. I unclasped my purse and pulled out a single wire transfer receipt, holding it up. I was cleaning out Richard's garage, I said evenly. I found a lockbox. It had about 100 of these inside, all routed to a Delaware LLC. Miriam's face went completely blank. The practiced warmth vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of an administrator about to expel a student. I'm not sure what you're showing me, Eleanor. I think you are, Miriam. I know you're the registered agent. I know Gerald used you to keep Richard in line. What I don't know is why you let Gerald terrorize my daughter this morning over a fake $14,000 debt. She set her iced tea down on a glass coffee table. The ice cubes clinked loudly in the quiet room. I don't control Gerald, she said quietly. sharply. Gerald is erratic. He's angry. He's been waiting 20 years for a payday that Richard promised him. Richard didn't owe him anything. Gerald wanted to sell a defense algorithm to people who would use it to kill. Miriam let out a short, cynical laugh. Oh, Eleanor, is that what Richard told you in whatever confession he left behind? That he was some kind of moral crusader? I froze. Miriam crossed her arms, looking at me with something resembling pity. Richard didn't steal the source code to save the world, sweetheart. He stole it because Gerald's buyer was offering 10 million and the European Telecom was offering 40. Richard wanted the bigger cut, but he was too much of a coward to actually spend it once he realized Gerald was hunting him. I stared at her, the sickeningly sweet smell of expensive vanilla candles suddenly making me want to vomit. The sheer arrogance on her face was breathtaking. She wasn't ashamed. She was condescending. She actually thought I was stupid. He used the school's private network to route his communications with the Swiss brokers, Miriam said, taking a delicate sip of her iced tea. He thought because he was the geography teacher and ran the AV club, nobody would notice the bandwidth spikes. But I noticed. I had the IT department pull the logs in 2010. I called him into my office, showed him the IP addresses, and asked him exactly how a public school teacher was routing encrypted traffic to a private wealth management firm in Geneva. She smiled, a thin, cruel line across her face. He cried, Eleanor, right there in my office. He told me everything. Gerald, the algorithm, the 47 million. He begged me not to report him. So, I offered him a deal. I would be his local registered agent for a shell company. I would monitor his behavior, make sure he didn't do anything flashy that would attract Gerald's attention, and in exchange, he paid me a consulting fee. It wasn't extortion. It was a service. You bled my family dry, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You took grocery money. You took the money we needed for my daughter's oral surgery. She was in agony for 9 months because we couldn't afford the copay, and you were taking hundreds of dollars out of our checking account to fund your ski trips to Aspen. I took what I was owed for keeping him out of federal prison. Miriam countered, setting her glass down sharply. Your husband made his choices. Don't stand in my living room and project his failures onto me. If he wanted to dip into his Swiss vault to pay for your daughter's teeth, he could have. He chose not to. He chose his hoard over his family. I just capitalized on his cowardice. My hand tightened around the wire transfer receipt until the paper crumpled. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip her glass coffee table and shatter it against the pristine hardwood floor. But rage wasn't going to save my house, and it wasn't going to protect Lily. You think you have this all figured out, I said slowly, forcing my heart rate down. You think because Richard is dead, your little arrangement just fades into the background. But here's what you don't know, Miriam. I didn't come here to appeal to your conscience. I came here to give you 24 hours to fix this. Miriam raised an eyebrow. Fix what? I have a corporate fraud investigator sitting at my kitchen island right now, I said, leaning in. He has already traced the LLC back to you. He has the property records for this townhouse, your place in Sedona, and the condo in Aspen. We have a fireproof box filled with 15 years of extortion payments. And unlike Richard, I am not terrified of Gerald. If you don't get Gerald to drop this lawsuit and back away from my daughter by noon tomorrow, I am handing everything over to the IRS, the FBI, and the state teachers' pension board. Miriam's confident posture finally cracked. Her shoulders stiffened, and the color drained from her face. If you blow this open, she hissed, you lose the 47 million. Gerald's people will claim it. The telecom company will freeze it. You'll get nothing. I already have nothing, I said, stepping backward toward her front door. I've had nothing for 26 years. I survived on generic brand pasta and a leaking roof while my husband played spy games in the basement. I do not care about the money in Geneva, Miriam, but I care about my house, and I care about my daughter. Call your attack dog off, or I burn us all down. I turned and walked out, slamming the heavy mahogany door behind me. The drive back to my house was a blur. My hands were shaking so hard I had to grip the steering wheel at 10 and 2 just to keep the car straight. I kept replaying Miriam's words. He chose his hoard over his family. He watched Lily cry through swollen, infected gums, and he made a conscious decision to let her suffer rather than risk his secret. When I pulled into the driveway, the black SUV was parked near the garage. I practically sprinted up the front steps and unlocked the door. Lily, I called out. In here, a small voice answered from the living room. I walked in to find my daughter curled up in the corner of our worn-out sectional sofa, her knees pulled to her chest. Her overnight bag was dropped on the rug. Duncan was sitting in the armchair opposite her, his laptop open, giving her quiet space. I sat down next to her and wrapped my arms around her. She was shaking. Mom, she whispered into my shoulder. What is happening? The guy who picked me up wouldn't say anything. He just stood by the door while I packed. Why did Gerald come to my apartment? I pulled back and looked at her. She had Richard's eyes, that same soft, hesitant brown. It broke my heart to look at them right now. I need you to listen to me, I said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. Your father was keeping a very large secret from us. Before you were born, he and Gerald created a piece of software, a very valuable piece of software. Your dad sold it secretly and hid the money in a bank account in Switzerland. He never told me. He never told Gerald. And because he was terrified Gerald would find out, he forced us to live like we were broke. Lily stared at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. How much money? A lot, I said, my voice catching. Enough that we never should have worried about anything. Her hand instinctively went to her jaw, the faint, barely visible scar under her ear where the surgeon had finally made the incision. During the surgery, she said, her voice dropping an octave. When we were selling the furniture. When you were crying in the kitchen because the electricity was going to be shut off. Yes. Lily blinked, and a tear spilled over her eyelashes. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was pure, unadulterated shock. He let me sit in pain for 9 months. He sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand, and told me we just had to hold on a little longer. He lied to my face. He lied to both of us, honey, and I am so sorry. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Gerald gave me the promissory note. It said $14,000. It's a fake, I promised her. Gerald is just using the exact amount of your surgery to guilt you. He dug into our past, figured out our lowest financial point, and fabricated a document to make you feel responsible. Lily reached into the front pocket of her sweatshirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to me right away. She just stared at it, her fingers trembling. When Dad came to visit me at my dorm for my birthday last October, Lily said, her voice hollow. A month before he had the stroke, he brought a bunch of paperwork. He said it was for my FOFSA renewal and some tax dependency forms. He told me to just sign the sticky notes, that he had already filled out all the boring parts. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. I looked over at Duncan. He had stopped typing on his laptop and was watching us intently. Lily, I asked gently, what did you sign? I don't know, she cried, finally handing the folded paper to me. But when Gerald slid the promissory note under my door today, he slid this under with it. He told me through the door that if I didn't convince you to sign over the house, he was going to take this to the police. I unfolded the paper. It was a photocopy of a notarized document. I scanned the dense legal text. It wasn't a FOFSA form. It was a transfer of liability. Richard had explicitly named Lily as the secondary custodian of the hidden physical servers in the basement. He had forged her initials on the subclauses and tricked her into signing the primary signature line. He legally tied our 19-year-old daughter to stolen corporate property. Duncan, I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion as I handed the paper across the coffee table. Duncan adjusted his glasses and read the document. His jaw tightened. This is a dead man's switch, Duncan said quietly. Your husband knew Gerald was getting closer. He knew if he died, Gerald would come for the house. By putting Lily's name on the hardware custody, he made her an accessory after the fact. Gerald is threatening to hand her over to federal authorities for possession of stolen trade secrets if you don't give him the property. My husband hadn't just hoarded wealth and impoverished his family. When he felt the walls closing in, he had used his own teenage daughter as a human shield. Duncan took his glasses off and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The faint, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly felt deafening in the silence of the living room. Can they actually do that? Lily asked, her voice cracking. Can they arrest me for something I didn't know I was signing? It's not about whether they can secure a conviction, Duncan said, his tone shifting from a detached investigator to something almost resembling a father. It's about the destruction of the process. If Gerald hands this to the FBI, they freeze your bank accounts. They pull you out of classes. They drag you into interrogation rooms. You spend the next 5 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees just trying to prove you were manipulated. Gerald isn't trying to put you in prison, Lily. He's trying to make the threat of it so painful that your mother hands over the keys to the house today. I picked up the photocopy. I looked at Richard's signature, neat and precise, right next to Lily's naive, hurried scrawl. He had done this in her dorm room. He had brought her a cupcake from that bakery she liked on 4th Street, kissed her forehead, and handed her the pen that could legally ruin her life. Who notarized it? I asked, staring at the blurry black stamp at the bottom of the page. Duncan leaned in. That's the weak point. You can't notarize a document without verifying the identity of the signatory in person. If Lily didn't sign this in front of a notary, the stamp is fraudulent. Let me see the name. I handed it to him. He squinted at the faint text. Faye Durbin, Duncan read aloud. State of Delaware. Delaware again, I muttered, just like Miriam's shell company. Which means Faye Durbin either doesn't exist, or she's on Gerald's payroll, Duncan said, opening his laptop again. If we can prove the notary is fraudulent, the document is void. But that takes time we don't have. Miriam is going to call Gerald right now. When she tells him you have the extortion receipts, he's going to realize his window is closing. He's going to panic. As if on cue, my phone vibrated in my purse on the kitchen counter. I walked over and pulled it out. It was a text from an unknown number. You think some old bank receipts change anything? I want the keys by 5 p.m. Or I send the custody forms to the field office. Ask Lily how she looks in orange. I stared at the screen. Gerald was unraveling. The calculated corporate intimidation was dropping, replaced by the desperate thuggery of a man who realized his 20-year payout was slipping through his fingers. He didn't care that I had proof of his extortion ring with Miriam. He knew a mother would always trade her own leverage to protect her child. I walked back into the living room and showed the phone to Duncan. He's doubling down, Duncan noted, his eyes narrowing at the screen. He's calling your bluff on Miriam. What do we do? Lily asked, looking between us. She looked so small on the couch, pulling the sleeves of her sweatshirt down over her hands. Mom, please. I don't want to go to jail. Just give him the house. We can leave. We don't need whatever is in the basement. If I give him the house, I said, crouching down in front of her so we were at eye level, he doesn't just get the servers. He gets the leverage. If he has the servers, he can definitively link the stolen algorithm to your father. And if he has this fake custody document, he can link it to you. He will hold this over our heads for the rest of our lives. Every time he needs money, every time he feels slighted, he'll threaten to expose you. We would never be free of him. I stood up and looked at Duncan. You said your team was ready to secure him if he broke in. But he's not breaking in. He's using paper. Paper can be countered, Duncan said, closing his laptop with a soft click. But we need your lawyer. Now, I dialed Alec Mercer. He picked up on the first ring, the background noise of a busy courthouse hallway echoing through the speaker. Eleanor, I filed the restraining order, Alec said quickly, his voice clipped and professional. A judge signed it 10 minutes ago. If Gerald goes within 500 feet of Lily, he's in contempt. Alec, it's worse, I said, my voice eerily calm. Gerald isn't just threatening her physically. He slid a document under her door. It's a transfer of liability, supposedly signed by Richard and Lily, naming her as the custodian of stolen corporate hardware. The courthouse noise seemed to vanish as Alex stopped walking. What stolen hardware, Eleanor? What exactly is in your house? I can't explain it over the phone, I said. But Gerald is threatening to go to the FBI by 5 p.m. if I don't sign over the deed. The document is fraudulently notarized by someone named Faye Durbin in Delaware. Alec, Richard tricked Lily into signing it under the guise of college financial aid forms. Alec let out a long, heavy breath. Okay, do not engage with him. Do not reply to his texts. I am leaving the courthouse right now. I'll be at your house in 40 minutes. If Gerald shows up before I do, lock the doors and call 911. Let the police deal with him. him. Alec, the police cannot come inside this house, I said firmly. Do you understand me? Under no circumstances can local law enforcement walk into my basement. There was a pause. The kind of profound, heavy pause a lawyer takes when they realize their client has crossed the line from a victim of harassment into an active participant in something highly illegal. 40 minutes, Alec repeated, his tone completely stripped of its usual warmth. He hung up. I put the phone down on the coffee table. Duncan was already making a call of his own, speaking in low, rapid German to someone on his team. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of tap water. I drank it in one long swallow, staring out the window at the quiet suburban street. A neighbor was walking his golden retriever. A delivery truck rolled slowly past the mailboxes. It was a perfectly normal Friday afternoon. While inside my house, I was preparing to wage a shadow war over $50 million and a stolen algorithm my dead husband had buried in the walls. Mom? I turned around. Lily was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She looked pale, her eyes darting nervously toward the basement door. Are we going to be okay? She asked softly. I set the empty glass on the granite countertop. I thought about the buckets in the hallway catching the freezing rain. I thought about Richard stroking my hair in the dental parking lot, promising we would survive. I wasn't going to make empty promises anymore. I don't know, I told her honestly. But nobody is taking you away from me, and nobody is taking this house until I say so. A loud, sharp knock echoed from the front door. Lily jumped, instinctively stepping backward into the living room. Duncan appeared from the hallway instantly, slipping his phone into his pocket. He didn't pull a weapon. He wasn't that kind of security, but his entire posture shifted into something rigid and imposing. It's too early for your lawyer, Duncan murmured, moving toward the foyer. He checked the live feed on his tablet. Who is it? I whispered. Duncan frowned, zooming in on the camera angle. It's a woman, late 60s, silver hair, silk blouse, Miriam Voss. She hadn't called Gerald. She had come straight here. Let her in, I said, wiping my damp hands on my jeans. Duncan unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Miriam stood on the porch, but the smug, condescending administrator I had left in the townhouse 30 minutes ago was gone. She looked visibly shaken. She was gripping her leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Eleanor, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She glanced nervously at Duncan, then at Lily, before locking eyes with me. We have a massive problem. I gave you 24 hours to call Gerald off, I said, crossing my arms. You didn't need to drive all the way here to tell me you failed. You don't understand. Miriam snapped, her voice trembling slightly. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila envelope. After you left, I tried to call him. He didn't answer, so I called my broker in Delaware to warn him that the LLC might be compromised. I wanted to freeze the accounts before your investigator could subpoena them. She threw the envelope onto the entry table. The accounts are already empty, Eleanor, Miriam said, her pristine facade finally crumbling. Gerald didn't just want the house. He cleared out the extortion fund this morning. $2 million, gone. He's not trying to force a settlement anymore. He's cashing out and running. Running from what? I demanded. Miriam looked at the basement door, a deep, primal fear in her eyes. He found a buyer for whatever Richard buried down there, she whispered, and the buyer isn't waiting for the lawsuit to clear. They're coming to take it. Duncan didn't blink. He didn't gasp or express shock. He simply reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and tapped a single button on the screen. He held it to his ear, his eyes never leaving Miriam's trembling face. Pull the perimeter back to the property line, Duncan said into the phone, his voice flat and authoritative. No one breaches the driveway. If a vehicle approaches, log the plates and block the apron. He hung up and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Who is the buyer? I asked Miriam, my voice so steady it felt like it belonged to someone else. I don't know, Miriam stammered, wrapping her arms around her silk blouse as if suddenly freezing. Gerald never told me the specifics. He just said he found a back channel to the original defense contractor, the one Richard stole it from 20 years ago. They don't care about the lawsuit or the house. They just want the source code. And Gerald promised he could deliver the physical drives today. And he drained your extortion fund to finance his escape, I said, putting the pieces together. He's not giving them the drives for a payout. He's giving them the drives to buy his life, and he's using the $2 million to vanish. He left me holding the bag. Miriam choked out, a tear finally spilling over her mascara. The LLC is in my name. The wire transfers trace back to my accounts. If the police look into this, I'm the one who goes to federal prison for extortion, not him. Good, Lily said. The word hung in the air, sharp as glass. We all turned to look at my 19-year-old daughter. She was standing by the edge of the sofa, her fists clenched at her sides, her eyes blazing with a fury I had never seen in her before. Good, Lily repeated, her voice shaking but defiant. You stole from us. You watched my dad force me to live with a rotting jaw so you could go skiing. I hope you rot in prison. Miriam opened her mouth to speak, but Duncan stepped between them. Emotions later, Duncan said briskly. Right now we have a logistics problem. Mrs. Harlow, if the original defense contractor is sending a retrieval asset, they aren't going to knock and present a warrant. They are going to secure the hardware by any means necessary. We cannot defend this house against a corporate extraction team. So what do we do? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. We remove the asset, Duncan said, already walking toward the kitchen and the basement door. If the hardware isn't here, the house loses its value. They won't burn resources occupying an empty shell. We need to extract the master server drives right now. I followed him to the basement stairs, pointing a finger at Miriam as I passed. You sit on that couch and you do not move. If you try to walk out that door, I will call the FBI myself and hand them the wire receipts. Miriam sank onto the sofa, looking entirely broken. I didn't feel an ounce of pity. The basement was exactly as I had left it. The jagged hole in the drywall exposed the heavy steel casing of the server rack, a blinking green light pulsing steadily in the gloom. Duncan didn't waste time. He grabbed the claw hammer I had used earlier and began smashing away the remaining drywall, ripping huge chunks of plaster and insulation out with his bare hands. Dust filled the air, thick and chalky, coating our clothes and catching in my throat. Help me pull the casing forward, Duncan grunted, wedging the claw of the hammer behind the steel frame. I grabbed the edge of the metal rack. It was sharp and freezing cold. On three, I said. 1, 2, 3. We pulled, with a screech of tearing metal and snapping drywall screws. The heavy rack slid forward a few inches across the concrete floor. The back of the server was a mess of thick black cables, hardwired directly into a dedicated conduit running straight to the breaker box. Richard had built a completely independent power supply for this thing. I need to cut the power, Duncan said, turning on his phone flashlight. If I pull the drives while they're spinning, the fail-safe might wipe the platters. Hold the light. I took his phone and shone it on the back of the machine. Duncan reached into his pocket and produced a heavy-duty folding knife. He didn't look for a switch. He simply grabbed the thickest black power cable, wedged the blade against it, and sawed through the rubber casing until the copper sparked. The basement plunged into darkness for a split second before my flashlight beam cut through the dust. The green light on the server died. The low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation fans spun down into total silence. Got it, Duncan muttered. He moved to the front of the rack, pressing a series of release latches. One by one, he slid the hard drives out of their bays. There were 4 of them. They looked surprisingly ordinary, just heavy rectangular blocks of metal and silicon. But holding one in my hand, feeling the density of it, I realized I was holding the exact weight of my husband's lies. This was the algorithm. This was the $47 million. This was the reason we ate generic cereal and drove a car without a functioning transmission. Duncan shoved 2 of the drives into his leather briefcase and handed the other 2 to me. Put these in a heavy bag, something inconspicuous. We hurried back up the wooden stairs. The kitchen was still quiet, but the atmosphere in the house felt utterly suffocating. Lily had found a canvas tote bag and was waiting by the island. I dropped the 2 drives into it. They landed with a heavy, dull thud. Headlights swept across the front window, cutting through the late afternoon shadows. Duncan moved instantly to the security monitor on the counter. I held my breath, gripping the edge of the granite. It's a silver Lexus, Duncan reported, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. Single occupant. The doorbell rang a moment later, followed by aggressive, rapid knocking. I walked to the front door and threw it open. Alec Mercer stood on the porch, his tie loosened, a thick leather briefcase gripped tightly in his hand. He looked furious. Get inside, I said, pulling him into the foyer and locking the deadbolt behind him. Alec took one look at Duncan, then at Lily clutching her overnight bag, and finally at Miriam Voss sitting on the living room couch like a condemned prisoner. Alec stopped dead in his tracks. Eleanor, Alec said, his voice dangerously low. What exactly have you dragged me into? I dragged you into the truth, Alec, I said, pointing toward the kitchen. The house isn't the asset. My dead husband buried stolen defense contractor hardware in the basement 20 years ago. Gerald was trying to steal the house to get it. Miriam was extorting Richard to keep quiet about it. And now, Gerald has sold the hardware to the original owners, and they are coming to take it. Alex stared at me. He was a seasoned civil litigator, a man used to dealing with nasty divorces, property disputes, and corporate contract breaches. He was not used to espionage. He slowly set his briefcase down on the hardwood floor. Tell me you did not touch the hardware. Duncan walked into the foyer holding his own briefcase. The hardware has been removed from the walls. The power supply is severed. The drives are secured. Alec dragged a hand down his face, letting out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. You just committed spoliation of evidence, at best. At worst, you're in possession of stolen trade secrets. Eleanor, I told you on the phone, I cannot defend you if you are actively engaged in a criminal conspiracy. I am not engaged in a conspiracy, Alec, I yelled, the anger finally boiling over. I am cleaning up my husband's mess. Gerald fabricated a legal document tying Lily to those servers. He threatened to hand her over to the FBI by 5 p.m. today. I am not going to let a 20-year-old defense algorithm ruin my daughter's life. Alec looked at Lily, who was standing quietly by the kitchen threshold, clutching the canvas tote bag holding the remaining drives. The lawyer's professional detachment faltered. He had known Lily since she was 10 years old. Show me the document, Alec demanded. I pulled the photocopy out of my pocket and handed it to him. Alec reviewed it, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon and stopping at the notary stamp at the bottom. Faye Durbin, Alec read aloud. State of Delaware. He looked up, his expression hardening. This is a forged notarization. A notary cannot operate across state lines without specific multi-jurisdictional licensing, which this stamp doesn't indicate, and they certainly can't verify a signature without the signatory physically present. This document is completely void. I know it's void, Duncan said calmly, but Gerald isn't trying to win a court case. He's trying to trigger a federal investigation. If he hands this to the FBI, the forgery won't matter until after Lily spends 2 years in litigation hell. So what is your play, mister? Alec asked, glaring at Duncan. Duncan Strand. I work in asset protection. Duncan adjusted his glasses. The play is leverage. Gerald has the fake document. We have the drives. If he wants to hand the drives over to his buyers, he needs us to give them to him. No, Alec said sharply. You do not negotiate with extortionists. And you certainly don't hand over stolen defense property to unknown corporate entities. We call the authorities. We hand the drives to the FBI ourselves. We explain the extortion, we present the forged document, and we cooperate. If you do that, Miriam spoke up from the couch, her voice trembling, they will freeze the offshore account, the $47 million in Geneva. It will be seized as proceeds of a crime. Eleanor gets nothing. Alec turned his head slowly, looking at me. $47 million? I swallowed hard. Richard sold the code to a European telecom. He hid the money. Alec let out a hollow, incredulous laugh. He looked around the modest foyer, the scuffed hardwood floors, the cheap brass light fixture overhead. Your husband was sitting on $50 million, and he made you fight me over my retainer fee last year? Yes, I said quietly. He did. Eleanor, listen to me, Alec said, his tone shifting to absolute gravity. If that money is from the sale of stolen property, it isn't yours. It belongs to the entity he stole it from, or the government will seize it under forfeiture laws. You cannot keep it. I don't care about the money in Geneva, Alec, I said, looking him dead in the eye. I really don't. I care about the fact that Gerald is trying to destroy my daughter to cover his own tracks. I care about the fact that my husband used my child as a human shield. I want to break Gerald. I want him to have absolutely nothing. Before Alec could respond, Duncan's tablet on the kitchen counter emitted a sharp, high-pitched chime. Duncan moved instantly, grabbing the device and tapping the screen. We have a situation, Duncan said, his voice dropping an octave. A vehicle just breached the perimeter. letter. It bypassed my men at the end of the street. Who is it? I asked, moving toward the window. Don't stand near the glass, Duncan warned, pulling me back. He turned the tablet so we could see the feed from the driveway camera. It wasn't a tactical team. It wasn't a black SUV filled with armed mercenaries. It was a rusted, dented U-Haul box truck. The truck reversed aggressively into my driveway, crushing the azalea bushes Richard had planted a decade ago. It slammed to a halt just inches from my garage door. The driver's side door swung open, and Gerald climbed out. He looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled, his hair was greasy and unkempt, and he was sweating profusely despite the mild afternoon weather. He walked around to the back of the truck, unlatched the heavy rolling door, and shoved it upward. What is he doing? Alec asked, squinting at the screen. Gerald reached into the back of the U-Haul and pulled out a heavy steel hand truck. Then, he turned and looked directly at the camera mounted above my garage. He didn't look like a criminal mastermind. He looked like a cornered animal. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text message. I'm here. Open the door or I send the PDF to the field office right now. He's here for the servers, Duncan said, watching the feed as Gerald began marching up the front walkway, the hand truck rattling loudly over the concrete. He doesn't know we've already pulled the drives. He thinks he can just roll in, intimidate you into stepping aside, and wheel the rack out to his truck. He's delusional, Alec said, pulling his phone out. He's trespassing and violating a restraining order. I'm calling the police. Alec, wait, I said, grabbing his wrist. If the police show up right now, they find the drives. They find Miriam. The whole thing blows up, and Lily gets dragged into the blast radius. Eleanor, he is a desperate man attempting a home invasion, Alec argued, trying to pull his arm away. You cannot handle this privately. I am not handing my daughter over to the federal government because my husband was a coward. I hissed, tightening my grip on his wrist. I looked at Duncan. You said you specialize in asset protection. Protect my asset. Duncan met my gaze. He didn't smile, but there was a flicker of something deeply pragmatic in his eyes. He reached into his jacket, bypassing his phone, and pulled out a pair of heavy black zip ties. Mr. Mercer, Duncan said smoothly, looking at the lawyer. As legal counsel, I highly advise you step into the kitchen and face the wall. You cannot be compelled to testify about something you did not witness. Alec opened his mouth to object, but the heavy thud of a fist pounding on the front door cut him off. Eleanor. Gerald's voice screamed from the porch, muffled by the heavy wood. Open the door. I know you're in there. 5 minutes, Eleanor. And I hit send. I looked at Lily. She was terrified, but she was holding the canvas bag with the hard drives tightly against her chest. Go to the kitchen with Alec, I told her softly. Do not come out. She nodded, backing away quickly. Alec hesitated for a fraction of a second, his legal instincts warring with his protective ones, before he grabbed Lily's arm and guided her out of the foyer. I turned back to Duncan. Open it. Duncan unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Gerald stood on the porch, his hand raised to pound on the wood again. He froze when he saw Duncan instead of me. Who the hell are you? Gerald demanded, his eyes darting frantically around the foyer. Where's Eleanor? I have a legal right to this property. I stepped out from behind Duncan. You have a frivolous lawsuit and a fake promissory note, Gerald. You don't have a right to anything. Gerald's face flushed with a mix of rage and panic. You think you're smart? You think because you hired some rent-a-cop, I won't do it? I have the document on my phone. One button, Eleanor, one button, and your kid goes away for possession of stolen defense property. She doesn't possess it, I said coldly. She's the legal custodian. Gerald spat, taking a step forward. Duncan immediately stepped into the doorway, blocking him. He didn't push Gerald, he just occupied the space with the immovable density of a brick wall. The physical asset is no longer on the premises, Duncan stated plainly. Gerald stopped. He blinked, the sweat dripping down his forehead. What? The servers are gone, Gerald. I lied smoothly, my heart pounding in my ears. We pulled them out of the basement an hour ago. They're already on their way to a secure vault. You brought a U-Haul for nothing. You're lying, Gerald stammered, looking past Duncan toward the hallway leading to the basement. Richard hardwired them into the foundation. You couldn't move them that fast. You're lying to me. Go check, I offered, stepping back and gesturing down the hall. Gerald looked at Duncan, who slightly shifted his shoulders, opening a narrow path into the house. Gerald hesitated, his paranoia fighting his desperation. Finally, he pushed past Duncan, his shoulder checking the doorframe, and practically ran down the hallway. We followed him. Gerald hit the basement stairs and stumbled down them, almost tripping in the dim light. I stood at the top of the stairs, Duncan right beside me, watching him. Gerald reached the bottom and stared at the jagged hole in the drywall. He saw the severed power cable, the empty server rack, and the dust settling on the concrete floor. He let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, and wasn't quite a sob. It was the sound of a man watching his only lifeline snap. Where are the drives? Gerald yelled, turning back to look up at us. His face was purple. Where are they? Do you have any idea who is coming for them? Do you know what they do to people who steal from them? I don't care, I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. You drained the LLC this morning. $2 million. Gerald, that was your exit fund. You don't need the drives. You just need to run. Gerald froze, his eyes widening. How do you know about the LLC? Because Miriam is sitting in my living room, I said. Gerald's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked up at me, standing at the top of the stairs, and finally realized he had entirely miscalculated the situation. He thought he was dealing with the timid, impoverished geography teacher's wife he had known for decades. He didn't realize that 26 years of manufactured poverty had forged something else entirely. Give me the drives, Eleanor, Gerald begged, his voice cracking, the aggression completely draining out of him. Please. They gave me a 5 p.m. deadline. If I don't hand over the hardware, they aren't going to sue me. They're going to kill me. I looked down at him, standing in the dust of my destroyed basement. He wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't some dangerous corporate spy. He was just a greedy, desperate man who had played a game way out of his league, and now the bill was due. The sheer pathetic reality of him kneeling on the concrete, begging me for his life, stripped away the last ounce of fear I had left. Alec, I called out, not taking my eyes off Gerald. Come down here. Bring a legal pad and a pen. I heard the floorboards creak above us. A moment later, Alec appeared at the top of the stairs, looking down at the scene. He took in the empty server rack, the severed cables, and Gerald weeping on the floor. Alec didn't ask questions. He just walked down the wooden steps, his polished dress shoes clicking against the concrete, and pulled a leather-bound notepad from his jacket pocket. What do you need? Alec asked quietly. I need a full, irrevocable confession, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the damp air. I want Gerald to write down, in his own handwriting, that the promissory note he gave my daughter today is a complete fabrication. I want him to state unequivocally that he forged the notarized custody document using a fake Delaware notary named Faye Durbin to extort a 19-year-old girl. And I want a quitclaim deed relinquishing any and all claims, present or future, to this property and to Richard's estate. Gerald looked up, his face streaked with sweat and drywall dust. Eleanor, there's no time for this. They're waiting. Then you better write fast, I told him coldly, because you aren't leaving this basement until Alec is satisfied with the legal binding of every single word. I turned to Duncan, who was standing silently beside the stairs. Go upstairs and get Miriam. Bring her down here. Duncan nodded and went up. A minute later, Miriam practically stumbled down the stairs, her pristine silk blouse now wrinkled and dusted with plaster. She took one look at Gerald and recoiled as if he were a wild animal. Miriam, I said, pointing to the concrete floor next to Gerald. Stand there. You're going to witness this. And when he's done, you are going to sign an addendum confirming that you acted as the registered agent for the Extortion LLC and that you facilitated the transfer of funds derived from blackmail. Alec will draft it. No, Miriam gasped, backing up against the cinder block wall. No, if I sign that, you can destroy me. I can already destroy you, Miriam, I reminded her, pulling the crinkled wire transfer receipt out of my pocket and holding it up. I have 15 years of bank records. I am giving you a choice. You sign the paper, and I lock it in a very secure vault. As long as I never see your face again, and you never speak a word of this to anyone, the paper stays in the vault. If you refuse, Alec makes a phone call to the district attorney right now, and you spend your retirement in a federal penitentiary. Miriam looked at Alec. Alec met her gaze with the icy practice stare of a man who destroyed people in courtrooms for a living. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. Miriam swallowed hard, her shoulders slumping in total defeat. She nodded once. Alec clicked his pen. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the basement was the scratching of ink on paper and Gerald's ragged, panicked breathing. Alec dictated the terms precisely, leaving no legal loopholes, no vague language, no room for interpretation. He made Gerald write it all out in longhand, forcing him to initial every single paragraph. When Gerald was finished, Alec handed the pad to Miriam, who wrote her own damning admission underneath it, her hand shaking so badly she could barely form the letters. Alec took the notepad back, reviewed it carefully, and finally nodded at me. It's airtight. If either of them ever breathes a word about you, Lily, or this house, this document sends them both to prison for extortion, forgery, and conspiracy. I turned to Duncan. Give him the drives. Duncan walked over to the stairs where he had left the canvas tote bag. He picked it up and tossed it onto the floor at Gerald's feet. The heavy metal components clanked against the concrete. Gerald scrambled forward on his hands and knees, clutching the canvas bag to his chest like a life preserver. He didn't even look inside. He just hauled himself to his feet, gave me one last terrified, unreadable look, and sprinted up the stairs. A few seconds later, the front door slammed. The U-Haul's engine roared to life, the tires screeching against the asphalt as Gerald backed out of the driveway and sped away to meet his buyers. He was their problem now. I looked at Miriam. Get out of my house. She didn't say a word. She walked up the stairs, moving slowly, like an old woman who had just realized exactly how fragile her life really was. We listened as the front door opened and closed with a soft click. The basement was silent again. Alec let out a long breath, snapping his notepad shut. Eleanor, you realize what just happened, right? We just let stolen corporate property walk out the door. No, Miss Mercer, Duncan said calmly, walking over to his scuffed leather briefcase resting on the utility sink. We let the liability walk out the door. Duncan popped the latches on his briefcase and flipped it open. Resting perfectly inside the padded compartments were two heavy, rectangular hard drives. Alex stared at them, then looked at the empty canvas bag Gerald had just carried out. You didn't give him all of them. A master server like this operates on a mirrored RAID array, Duncan explained, adjusting his glasses. There are 4 drives. Gerald took 2. The data is duplicated across them. The defense contractor will get what they want, the source code. They will be satisfied. They will leave Gerald alone, and more importantly, they will assume the hardware has been fully recovered. They won't come looking for the rest. And what about those? I asked, pointing at the 2 drives in the briefcase. These, Duncan said, snapping the briefcase shut, are leverage. If Gerald's buyers ever somehow trace the code back to this house, we have half of their proprietary algorithm in our possession. It's a mutually assured destruction policy. I will place these in a secure, anonymous deposit box under a blind trust. They will never see the light of day unless we need them. It was over. The physical threat, the legal threat, the decades of anxiety and lies, it had all just been packed into a U-Haul and driven away, leaving me standing in a dusty basement with a brilliant lawyer and a brutally efficient security expert. What about the money in Geneva? Alec asked gently, looking at me. $47 million. It's sitting in a Swiss vault, tied to a dead man who lied to you every day of your marriage. I thought about Richard. I thought about the way he used to sigh heavily when the electric bill arrived, rubbing his temples and telling me we just needed to tighten our belts. I thought about him sitting in Miriam's office, crying because he got caught, and deciding to sacrifice his family's comfort to save his own skin. He had chosen the secret over us. The money in Geneva, I said, my voice steady and clear, was earned through 26 years of unpaid labor, emotional abuse, and medical neglect. It belongs to me, and I am going to collect every single cent of it. Alex smiled faintly. It wasn't his lawyer smile. It was a real one. I'll arrange the international probate filings. We'll set up a shell corporation of our own, entirely legal, to repatriate the funds. The heirs will take their cut, but I promise you, Eleanor, you will never have to put a bucket under a leaking roof ever again. Thank you, Alec, I said. I walked up the stairs and into the kitchen. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Lily was sitting at the island, her overnight bag on the floor next to her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes wide and searching. Is he gone? She asked quietly. He's gone, I promised her, walking over and wrapping my arms around her shoulders. I kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. He's never coming back. Neither is Miriam. The paper you signed is destroyed. It's over. Lily leaned into me, letting out a heavy, shuddering sigh of relief. Her hand drifted up, her fingers resting lightly against the faint scar on her jawline. Mom, she whispered. What do we do now? I looked around the kitchen. I saw the cheap laminate countertops we had installed ourselves because we couldn't afford stone. I saw the rattling refrigerator that froze the lettuce in the crisper drawer. I saw the ghost of the man who had sat at this island, eating off chipped plates, hoarding an empire in the dark. I took a deep breath, the cold clarity of the Swiss skyline settling firmly into my chest. First, I said, we call a contractor to fix the roof. And then, I think it's time we both took a trip to Geneva.